Right. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, everybody. Welcome to our May BIPS lecture series presentation, The Connected Histories of James Baillie Fraser's The Kuzzilbash, A Tale of Khorasan with Brenden Benjamin. I'm going to run through a couple of introductory sorts of slides, and then we'll hand over to Brenden. So our first slide is what's going on for our webinars in June. June 18, 5 p.m. The amazing Technicolor use of the Zulukaya manuscript from Bukhara in the Sissinghurst collection with Jamie Comstock Skip. And then this is the way you can keep in touch with us via Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or these other ones here, as well as the main BIPS website at the very bottom. Just to remind folks of BIPS speaker policies and BIPS being a UK charity based here in the United Kingdom, we are subject to its charity rules and such, and therefore we are committed to demonstrating open-mindedness and expect to challenge and be challenged in protecting inclusion, non-discrimination, and freedom of expression within the parameters of British law. So we have civil discussions here, but we affirm that every member of BIPS staff and visitors are entitled to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. But we are a non-political organization and do not engage in expression of political views about any country or religion. In that light, then, for those who are not used to this, all questions and answers here on Zoom are you go to the bottom of the Zoom icon and look for Q&A and put your questions there. And then I, as the host, Andrew Newman, the BIPS outreach director, then relay those to the speaker, so the speaker doesn't have to do that as well. But I reserve the right to modify or change or even add to some of these given time and other kinds of constraints that there may be that obtain. So here we are ready to go. May I introduce Brenden Benjamin? And Dr. Brenden Benjamin recently received his PhD from the University of St. Andrews. He's a scholar of Iranian cultural history and comparative literature with additional specializations in post-colonial theory, 19th century British literature and culture, and French colonial history. His research methodology is interdisciplinary and multilingual, with an emphasis on the points of intersection, connection, and overlap between societies, cultures, and temporal epochs. He is particularly interested in how oral narrative traditions and works of fiction contribute to identity formation and collective cultural memory. So just a reminder to folks who have questions and answers to please use the Zoom function for Q&A. And with that, I turn over to Brenden. Brenden, the floor, physically, metaphorically, is yours.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you everybody at BIPS for giving me the opportunity to come on today and speak about my work on Fraser's 1828 novel, The Kuzzilbash. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully just get going. So my work on this text comprises a chapter of my doctoral thesis titled Journeys in Storytelling, Representations of Iran in British Travel Writing 1800 to 1859. The thesis primarily deals with the fictive and fictional narratives written by the first wave of British diplomats who traveled to Iran in the early 19th century. I describe my work as full stop, in the sense that it is interdisciplinary, intercultural, temporal, lingual, textual, theoretical, etc., etc. What I mean by this is that it is principally a literary work, but it is also deeply historical and also a study of political theory. It is primarily about Iran, but it is also about a British society and culture, as well as those of Turkmen, Arabs, and many others in the region. This is a work that is written in English, and yet in many ways I think would be incomplete without the attention that it pays to Persian idiomatic expression, regional dialect differences, the etymology of Persian words, and also the translation methods employed by those who sought to bring Persian material to English language readers. My work is grounded in the culture of the early Qajar era, but it also looks back relationally to highlight the connective threads between this period and those of Nader Shah, the Safavids, the medieval period of the Seljuks and Omar Khayyam, and of course the Arab conquests and Iran's ancient period. The methodology itself is very much built on a foundation of critical theory and post-colonial theory, And yet it also takes a turn that I like to think of not so much as counter, but rather post-Saidian or post-Orientalism, in the way that it challenges some of the conventions and particularly the binaries within Orientalism and post-colonial traditions. So today, I hope that I'll be able to demonstrate a bit of this, certainly not all of it, but hopefully most. And I think that the Kuzzilbash is a particularly emblematic of my work as a whole, insofar as it's a text which also exists between multiple traditions and endeavors to be multiple things, including a tale of travel, a romance, and a fictionalized historical account. It was written by a Scotsman in the early 19th century, but is narrated from the perspective of a fictional soldier from Khorasan named Ismail. Ismail lives roughly 100 years prior to when Fraser traveled through Iran, and the novel features events which include the Afghan occupation of Isfahan, the impending fall of the Safavids, and the rise of the General Nader, who would eventually become Nader Shah. So within all of this, Fraser's narrative explores many of the positive aspects of tribal culture that Iranian society itself often neglects or rejects. And it also examines the regional attitudes of Iran's multi-ethnic societies around identity and belonging. My work in these subjects consists of a comparative reading between the novel and a piece called The Veiled Prophet of Khorasan, which is the first section of Thomas More's book-length poem from 1817, Lalla Rookh. Both works narrativize the plight of people in Iran who have historically been treated as societal others by the nation's ruling powers and institutions. While the Kuzzilbash focuses on Iran's Turkmen people, the Veiled Prophet of Khorasan draws attention to the strife of Zoroastrians in the early period of the Abbasid Caliphate's rule. Now, for the purposes of today's discussion, I'm actually not going to speak about More's work for a number of reasons. One of them being that given the time constraints, it just would be too rushed, but also because there is already a substantial corpus of criticism on the allegory between Ireland and Iran that More creates in his work. On the other side, there is, to my knowledge, through all of my research, no such work on the allegory between Scotland and Khorasan that Fraser creates in the Kuzzilbash. So my hope really for today is for Fraser's work to shine and hold center stage. My reading of the Kuzzilbash essentially examines the way in which Fraser's text negotiates Iranian pejorative preconceptions about the nation's tribal peoples, specifically Turkmen society, and ultimately highlights the value that these societies bring to Iran's cultural identity by emphasizing their contributions to crucial periods of the nation's history. This includes surveying Fraser's other works of fiction and nonfiction in relation to the Kuzzilbash to illuminate his view of a link between Khorasan's Turkmen people and Scotland's Highland clans. Now, before we get into that, we do have a few layers of context to get through. Beginning with the historical context of the novel itself, it is set during the reign of Shah Tahmasp II, who was the penultimate ruler of the Safavid dynasty. At this point, monarchic authority was nearly non-existent. The crown's finances were depleted and its military strength overexhausted due to efforts at trying to unseat the Afghan Hotak leaders who had occupied Iran's then capital of Isfahan. In the background, the General Nader is gaining power. He's leading campaigns to suppress the tribal infighting that has taken the nation by storm and enlisting soldiers, some of whom do join on their own free will, but many of whom, if not most, are often through means of coercion and brute force into his service to aid in his efforts at eventually taking back the capital. So by the end of the novel, he is still only a general. So as readers, we actually do not get to see him rise to the status of Shah. However, Fraser does position Nader in a very interesting place, which is somewhere in between a semi-sinister foreshadowing of the fact that he would eventually turn on the monarchs that he once served, but also there is a justification that Fraser provides, suggesting that his rise to power is in fact a necessary means to unseating an oppressive, ineffective, and weak monarchic leadership in favor of a leadership that is based on tribal values. Central to these events and dynamics are figures known as the Kuzzilbash. This word refers to any of the 7 Turkmen tribes who originally supported the Safavids in their rise to power. Nader's own ancestral tribe, Afshar, is one of these seven clans, and the term was given to these people originally by the Ottomans as a reference to their attire, specifically the signature red caps, which you can see in the images on the screen, which was a signifier of the soldiers' Safavid loyalty. They were originally the very crucial manpower that established and enforced early Safavid authority. However, due to a number of reasons, they eventually turned against the dynasty and ended up being crucial in supporting Nader's rise to power instead. As for the historical context of the period in which Fraser journeyed to Iran, he arrived during the reign of Fath Ali Shah, who was the second ruler of the newly established Qajar dynasty. The Qajars themselves were a tribe of Turkmen origin, and Fath Ali Shah's predecessor, the founder of the dynasty, Agha Muhammad Khan, established their reign by consolidating the Iranian territories that had been fractured by 70 years of Zand and Afsharid rule since the time of Nader Shah himself. The Qajars are also responsible for moving the nation's capital to Tehran from Isfahan to mark a new age of dynastic rule. Now, Fath Ali Shah inherited a hostility with the Russian Empire that was caused by Agha Muhammad Khan's campaigns to reclaim the Caucasus. This hostility would eventually transform into two full-scale Russo-Persian wars that ultimately pushed Fath Ali Shah into military disgrace and stripped Iran of many of the lands it once held, including present-day Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Dagestan. The British intervention in Iran at this time began with a desire to establish a relationship with the Qajars that would help transform Iran into a buffer state. The Russian encroachments from the north posed a threat to Britain's crown jewel of colonial enterprise, which is India, and they were also facing a lot of anxiety due to Napoleon's campaigns through Egypt on the west. So Iran presented an opportunity with a young dynasty that was under a lot of pressure and quite impressionable to foreign aid. And this is the context in which figures like Fraser and his contemporaries, such as John Malcolm and James Mourier, came to Iran. And Malcolm and Mourier are figures who I discuss in other areas of my work as well. I want to briefly give a synopsis of the novel, just so that we have an understanding of what's going on before we get into the details of it itself. So, as I said, this tells the story of a soldier from Khorasan named Ismail. The narrative begins while he is quite young, during a Turkmen raid of his village. The tribe pillages the village and kills his family, and they see him demonstrate, despite being a child, a sense of bravery and valor in trying to protect himself. Admiring these traits, they take him as one of their own and decide to raise him. Now, the way that he survives this rather brutal upbringing is by developing a close friendship with the tribal chief's son, Selim, and eventually he falls in love with the chief's daughter, Shirin. His time with the Turkmen proves to be very interesting in the way that it challenges his sense of identity, belonging, and his associations of different cultural values. He very quickly grows to admire a lot of the traits of the Turkmen that he would have initially seen as wild, savage, primitive, etc., to use all the colonial terms. Instead, his time with them teaches him that the tribe, in fact, has a strong sense of protection, that they value self-governance, and that they have an unbelievable level of resilience at sustaining their own way of life. And he sees this through the tribe interacting with one another on their own terms rather than through the lens of Iranians who perceive them as a foreign threat, despite living on the same lands as themselves. Now, this conflict of identity that he develops sort of comes to a crashing halt when his love affair with Shireen leads to an unexpected pregnancy. Fearing that the chief is going to kill him, Salim helps Ismail escape, and his adventures eventually lead him into the service of General Nader. Now, he's reunited with other Iranians. He is among the ranks of other Kuzzilbash soldiers, and yet this doesn't really do anything to soften the difficulties and anxieties around his own identity and sense of belonging. He's spent so much time with the Turkmen that he actually finds the Iranians foreign now and finds it very hard to assimilate with them. After a great deal of sort of emotional soul searching and debauchery, he ends up on a mission to take back Esfahan from Afghan leadership. After a successful siege of the city and several battles that result in Nader's victory, Ismail eventually comes to face with his past. While in Mashhad, he finds Shireen on the brink of death in the slums of the city and learns that Selim had been taken prisoner by Nader during a clash between the Kuzzilbash troops and Selim's Turkmen tribe. Ismail also discovers that his child had never been born, and Fraser's text is quite ambiguous in this. The language is not necessarily clear, and we sort of led to believe in a very ambiguous way that Shireen miscarried the child out of distress. Another tragedy that Ismail learns is that the land that the tribe had inhabited, which he grew to also love, has been laid to waste, and most of its members have been killed by Nader's soldiers. This leads him to publicly plea in front of Nader to grant Shireen her protection and Selim his freedom. The request leads to an audience between Nader and Selim, whose dignified bravery, in fact, earns Nader's respect and benevolence. Selim is set free, and this closes Fraser's Tale of Khorasan. So there were a number of influences that went into the way that Fraser wrote this story. Um, Principally were his travels and the admiration that he developed for Iran's Turkmen during his time in Khorasan. Another is the influence of his own Scottish heritage and his observation of a connection between the culture of the Scottish Highland clans and the Khorasan Turkmen tribes. An added layer is that there seems to be a sort of generational legacy around the subject of Nader Shah within the Fraser family. And we'll get into that section a little bit later. So Fraser himself was born in Inverness, and he grew up with four brothers, all of whom but himself actually were employed by the East India Company. And this is because he himself had very little talent for business. He tried and he failed until 1820, and running a family plantation in present-day Guyana, and also operating a trading house in Calcutta. And I'll stress again, he truly failed at these endeavors. He ended up with more losses than anything to show for it. So this led him to begin traveling around India with one of his brothers in 1820, and the following year, he joined the Iran-bound mission of another agent of the East India Company, Dr. Andrew Jukes. Now, Jukes died of cholera quite early in the journey, and that appears not to have stopped Fraser from going on his own explorations. The texts that he later wrote about his travels, and they're quite extensive, built him the reputation of an expert on Iran and eventually led to his employment with the Foreign Office, which ended up sending him back to Iran on a mission in 1833. He was a prolific writer, and throughout his career, he produced several travel books and works of fiction, two encyclopedic histories, and a narrative about his time serving as the host to a cohort of Iranian princes who stayed in London between 1835 and 1836. I do want to draw attention to a couple of elements about Fraser's first visit to Iran, which remain a bit open for question and are slightly suspicious. One thing that sets him apart from his contemporaries is that when he went on this initial visit, he had no professional or official affiliation with any organization like the East India Company or the British government. Unlike the rest of his contemporaries who were diplomats, soldiers, etc., the historical source material on his life presents him as going as an independent solo traveler, very much a tourist with the luxury of personal connections to soldiers or administrators within the company. And I suppose to some degree, this accounts for the luxury that he was able to have of having the company's protection of their soldiers alongside him at a couple of times. But the fact that he didn't necessarily have any financial support or purposeful mission to go is interesting. And another element that sort of raises questions about really if there was an ulterior intent of him being there was the way that he managed to gain privileged access to areas of Iran that would not necessarily have been accessible to foreigners and particularly non-Muslims. He seemed to learn a lot very quickly, and he really wanted to get access to the inner shrines and the inner sanctums of the shrine of Imam Reza. So what he does is he ends up falsely, of course, but proclaiming an oath of conversion to Islam, and this grants him access. There are further details on these elements of his travels in the biographies of Fatima Sudavar Fatma Fatmayan. She and Dennis Wright seem to cover his life the most extensively, and if there is any interest into these aspects of his life, I would encourage anybody to go and check those sources. But again, the point is that these two elements of his travels remain open for question. They almost raise more questions than they actually answer about what his purpose was. And given that in his second voyage, he was tasked with going to Iran to report on Russian activity in the region. So that leaves us with a lot to wonder about whether he truly was in Iran as an independent traveler or if there was other if there were other intentions involved. So as I've said, there is a very strong connection in much of Fraser's work between his observations about the Turkmen of Khorasan and his own Scottish heritage. He views a link between them insofar as that these are tribal societies with a value for their own independence, forced to suffer the oppression and suppression of an alien political and cultural influence, obviously in the case of Scotland, England, and in the case of the Turkmen, centralized Iranian governments and authority. Now, there is an irony that shouldn't be lost on Fraser's readers about his Scottish pride and Turkmen sympathies. Um, his family was generationally entrenched in the global imperialist work of the East India Company. As a whole, this family embodies something referred to as the imperial nexus of Enlightenment Edinburgh. And this is a tradition in which 18th and early 19th century Scots actively sought the financial and social opportunities that the business of empire provided. Now, again, Fraser was never employed by the company, and he had a much more romantic sensibility geared towards writing, drawing, and painting. But his early plantation work and his work with the Foreign Office later in his life directly link him to a tradition of imperialistic activity. Still, it's my belief that there is a nuance to the Kuzzilbash that positions Fraser somewhere in between the prejudices of Britain's 19th century culture of coloniality and a deeply profound understanding of the people and cultures he observed during his travels. This nuance exists primarily in the work's attempt to reconcile, albeit to ends that are often inconclusive or open to interpretation, elements of Iran's culture that may not be as polar as they initially appear, and that have actually come to be entwined within one another. When it comes to the wider perception of Turkmen during these periods, the general consensus among Iranians was not a favorable one. The Turkmen were primarily pastoral nomads who inhabited the remote lands of an unstable, dangerous, and unsettled landscape. Eventually, their cultural character ended up being viewed in similar terms. They were primarily seen as violent raiders, slavers, and plunderers who caused chaos and fear through the attacks that they led on small towns and villages, where they would capture Iranians and sell them at slave markets. These actions led Iranians to blame the Turkmen for causing the destruction of the land they rode through and for perpetuating such widespread fear that trade and cultivation in Khorasan drastically declined and villages even became abandoned. Now, while it is true that Turkmen nomads were raiders and slavers, the nearly exclusive blame that they received for Khorasani decline during this period is not. Well over a century of dynastic upheaval, fighting between tribes of many different backgrounds, foreign invasion, and most importantly, the failings of the administration and governance of the Safavids, Afsharids, and Qajars were all major forces that caused the ruin that befell Khorasan. This prejudicial fallacy is something that Fraser's novel tackles throughout. When Ismail is taken captive, he initially starts with a perception of Turkmen people as the terrifying, villainous figures of a wild, unforgiving, and uninhabitable terrain. And then over time, he is proven wrong. When he's taken to their encampment, he sees that the tribe has actually set up a permanent home in a fictive setting, which Fraser calls the Chishme Jamali, or the Fountain of Beauty. This location features rivers, lakes, freshwater springs, and the remains of gardens that overgrow into really lush vegetation. And this is the space in which Ismail observed the tribe's resourcefulness in creating a home. The passages that describe the scenery features a great deal of decorative language, although that decorative language is applied specifically to natural elements, to trees, to water, to rocks. And this is used to stress the concertedness through which the tribe's actions have been able to transform a natural setting into a functional living space. Here, Ismail observes women coming to fill water vessels and men smoking shisha pipes under a sycamore tree and children playing and listening to stories. And all of this challenges Ismail to reflect on how and why he began with a perception of the Turkmen as villainous in the first place, and to further assess why he attributes value to different cultures, customs, and way of life altogether. This also highlights the bias in Iranian characterizations of Turkmen as the ones at fault for Khorasan's decline. Ismail's recognition that the tribes of the region had established a sense of permanence nods to their flexibility and resilience at being able to make a home out of an environment that he might have initially considered unlivable. Before he arrives to this idyllic setting of the Cheshma Jamali, they march the deserted, desiccated lands and ruined towns that are a little bit more befitting his preconception of the lands where these people live. However, during this march, Ismail also observes that the tribe has transformed these ruins into, quote, strongholds for storing their booty and protecting their wives and families in case of attack. And here Fraser's syntax is extremely telling. His unification of storing plundered goods and protecting families connects the two ideas as actions that collectively contribute to the preservation of Turkmen freedom. During the 18th and 19th centuries, nomadism and the habitation of remote settings were means through which Iran's Turkmen people escaped exploitation and suppression from the Safavids, Afsharids, and Qajars, who all at different times forced the Turkmen into service against their will as soldiers or laborers. By geographically placing themselves beyond the reach of Iran's official authorities, these tribes were seeking to maintain the autonomy of their self-governance and reframe their relationship with Iran's more settled communities. Raiding, plundering, and capturing slaves were in fact the practices through which Turkmen societies shifted a situation where they were potentially exploited by Iran's central and regional military forces to a dynamic in which they were viewed by Iranians as the exploiters. Fraser's allusion to the relationship between Turkmen plundering and freedom lays forth circumstances that highlight the conditionality of Ismail's perspective of savage or primitive Turkmen otherness. While Ismail arrives with a negative view of the Turkmen people, he is ultimately confronted with situations that reveal the society's collected efforts to protect their families and community. As he spends more time among them, he eventually develops an appreciation for these qualities, and this value slowly takes the place of the prejudices he previously held. Now, there are a handful of interesting inaccuracies in Fraser's work. He took a number of creative liberties, and one of them, if perhaps the most significant, is his portrayal of Nader's character. So, the Nader of the Kuzzilbash does feature aspects of his historical namesake's ruthless determination, but he also exhibits a great deal of benevolence. This quality ends up being more crucial to the specific trajectory of the narrative because it is ultimately Nader's kindness that saves Salim's life. Nader demonstrates that he values bravery and honor more than he condemns the differences and opposition of others, so long as they do not threaten his supremacy. Now, keeping in mind that at this time, the British knowledge and understanding about Iran was quite new, many readers might have taken material in works like the Kuzzilbash might have taken this material at face value. However, even then, Fraser's portrayal of Nader was met with skepticism. A review from the July 1828 edition of Monthly Magazine questioned this portrayal, describing Nader as somebody who, quote, makes, it must be allowed, a much more commanding and even more respectable figure than Sir John Malcolm's history we think will sanction, end quote. And this is a reference to John Malcolm's 1815 History of Persia, which was a monumental text covering the span of Iran's history from the ancient period to the time that he himself first visited in 1800. But what this critic is relaying is that Fraser's Nader is in fact so fictionalized that even the novel's earliest readers were able to identify that this is a representational character, and that truly is what he is. He is an embodiment of the traits that Fraser wished him to possess for the narrative purposes of this text, rather than being a close reflection of the historical person. And this is something which Fraser, I believe, took inspiration from in what I mentioned was a text by his grandfather and his family's interest in Nader's life. When collecting the historical material for the Kuzzilbash, Fraser didn't need to look much further than the writings of his own family from 80 years prior. His grandfather, James Fraser, wrote what many consider to be the first English language book on Nader Shah. The senior Fraser was a writer and administrator for the East India Company, and he gathered a lot of information during his time, not in Iran specifically, but rather in India and Yemen. And much of the material that he gathered on Nader Shah was inaccurate in and of itself. There were often long gaps in between periods of information being passed between stations, and even the accounts that were provided to him in the first place were very personalized accounts of Nader's character. So, when crafting this version of Nader for the sake of his historical fiction, James Baillie sort of took his cues from his grandfather, both literally and also kind of methodologically, to craft the character of somebody that was much more interesting to him and much more personal than one that was historically accurate. So the senior Fraser and his brother Alexander experienced a considerable amount of controversy during their lives. Alexander was accused of capturing Jacobite forces during the 1745 revolts. And upon his return to Britain, James was also challenged for inciting Jacobitism, despite him actually being in India during the uprising. He was later acquitted by the British government. However, the writings of James Baillie reveal that a tone of Scottish patriotism expressed in Jacobite sympathies had continued to ring through two generations of the family lineage and became crucial to the lens through which he viewed Iran during his travels. As the younger Fraser drew on his grandfather's work when crafting the Kuzzilbash, it is clear that his efforts at building the multidimensional features of Nader's character and representation derive from a tradition of conceiving a much more imaginative and favorable character of the warlord turned Shah. Another inaccuracy and inconsistency has something to do with the dates in this work. At the beginning of the narrative, Ismail states that he was born in 1740, and this is temporally illogical, given that the historical Nader had already crowned himself Shah by 1736 and died in 1747. Then later in the novel, Ismail states that Nader began his efforts to take back Esfahan in 1728, and this is perhaps slightly more accurate, given that the siege of Esfahan itself took place in 1729. Now, it remains open for question whether the inconsistent dates of this novel are a fact-checking oversight or a misunderstanding of the period's historical timeline, or a conscious stylistic choice. However, this feature does align with other fictionalized elements of the narrative, such as Fraser's representation of Nader's character. These qualities ultimately dilute the novel's historicity in favor of its fictional features, and particularly when read from a retrospective perspective, they appear as an extrapolation of Ismail's experiences from their temporally specific context. This allows Fraser's exploration of prejudices and preconceptions, and his narrative about leadership based on tribal values to really remain the focal point and show that these are really what the story is about and that the rest of it is just sort of historical backdrop. Speaking now to the allegory between Scotland and Khorasan itself. The methodology of my reading relies a great deal on a term used by Lewis Tyson in her 2006 work, Critical Theory Today. This term is one that she uses is called the proper self, and I appropriate this term to the novel's Iranian context to refer to an idea that I describe as the identity of Iran proper. So in her work, Tyson describes the construction of a proper self or an identity that arises through the act of othering, which creates a sort of us versus them mentality in which the self is everything that is good and the other is everything that is savage, exotic, or not even human at all. So I adapt this term to the idea of Iran proper and use it to describe the identity with which Ismail identifies at the beginning of the novel. The self of Iran proper generally excludes or at least neglects the breadth of Iran's multi-ethnic diversity. It values Persianate ideals and stems in great part from Ferdowsi's narrative of Iranian grandeur and kingship in the Shahnameh. The culture of Iran proper typically favors the nation's ancient history, as did Fraser and his British contemporaries who viewed the modern Iranian state as ruined and backwards. The perception of Iran's Islamic culture within the idea of Iran proper is something which is rather divided and temporally specific. There are different strands of this, and one Iranian perspective, which was prominently shared by the Western Orientalists, negatively views Islam as a lasting import and imposition of Arab culture that represents the dilution of a quote unquote pure Iranian culture. Another outlook, which developed as a result of the Safavid mass conversion of Iran to the Twelver sect, views Twelver Shiism as a defining characteristic of Iranian identity for its emblematic and historical opposition to Sunni Arab rule and theology. This perspective held prominence during the period of Fraser's travels among Iranians and during the era of the Kuzzilbash's plot. Geographically, the notion of Iran proper favors urban settings with vibrant cultural activity like Shiraz and Esfahan, and religious hubs like Qom and Mashhad. However, it can also include rural societies who share close affiliations with dynastic or religious figures of influence, such as the Afsharids themselves. And the culture of Iran proper, lastly, also favors the Persian language over the many other languages spoken throughout Iran. So as this applies to the relationship that Fraser builds between Scotland and Khorasan, we see this as something that appears more so throughout all of his work. It's not necessarily ostensible at first glance when reading the Kuzzilbash on its own, but when going through his works of nonfiction and his other fictional works, such as a text from 1832 called The Highland Smugglers, this becomes much more apparent. For example, in his travelogue, The Narrative of a Journey into Khorasan, he references Scottish Highland clans as a point of comparison to textualize one of the scenes in front of him. He writes, "A camp of Indians, a horde of gypsies, a group of the wildest north of Scotland, or Irish fishing huts, with their inhabitants, were the collections rapidly suggested by what we saw. There was something of all of these, and yet none of them can convey any just idea of a Turkmen camp." Now, despite Fraser's assertion that nothing can compare to the site of a Turkmen camp, he does make this comparison anyway. And it's not just that these clans are the only recollections that the Guklan evoke for him. However, all of these allusions, and particularly to the ones to the inhabitant of Scotland's wild north, indicate that his Highland heritage occupies a prominent place in his personal consciousness, and it is what informs his interpretation of the cultures that he encounters during his travels. Fraser does maintain a distinction of the cultural specificity between the peoples he mentions, but simultaneously indicates that his framework for understanding each of them entails an acknowledgement of the shared characteristics across tribal clans and cultures. He addresses these characteristics in the final passage of dialogue in the Kuzzilbash, for example, where Salim explains his desire to return to his homeland after receiving Nader's pardon. He writes, quote, "I, wild, ungovernable, enthusiastic, and ambitious, must not wander from mine. Our kindred are gone. Already does the rank herbage cover their bones. The ashes of their habitations have been scattered to the four winds of heaven. Of our tribe, but a few remain, the scattered pearls of a broken chaplet, but they do not the less demand the protection of their chief. I shall be my care to reunite them. With them, I will range the deserts where my fathers dwelt. I will once more establish the fortune of my tribe and exalt the name Tekeh, or the last of my race shall find a nameless grave in its wide and barren bosom." End quote. So this passage does not necessarily describe the scenery of Khorasan in detail. However, it does present the traits of an individual character as resulting directly from his upbringing and as a reflection of the region to which he ancestrally belongs. The terms that Salim uses to describe himself, ungovernable, enthusiastic, and ambitious, implicitly also refer to the Khorasan territory and the people who inhabit it. Salim's description of barren lands, deserts, and rotting greenery on top of the bones of his kindred express a fallen state of being. However, this fallen state also implicitly stresses the significance of something that existed beforehand, that being the starting point of freedom from which the region and its people have suffered the misfortune to fall. The romanticism of the situation derives from Salim and his people's display of resilience and resistance, which Fraser emphasizes with the image of the broken chaplet scattered pearls. While the chaplet itself implies a sense of triumph, for which chaplets were commonly worn by the Romans, The scattered pearls indicate the losses that took place on this path to victory. We also see an element of this connection in Fraser's writing in the introduction to his novel, The Highland Smugglers. He preludes the text with a sort of descriptive passage stating, quote, that this text is descriptive partly, as its title imports, of the habits and manners of a class of people who very long ago abounded through the Highlands, and who, in spite of every attempt at control or legislative enactment on the part of the government, are still to be found here, end quote. This passage echoes Salim's tone at the end of the Kuzzilbash insofar as it draws attention to a long-standing history and tradition of resistance against oppressive powers. Salim's emphatic assertions of his generational responsibility to preserve the survival of his people implies a similar sentiment to what Fraser writes about Scotland's clans in the introduction to the Highland Smugglers. The connective threads in Fraser's work suggest that despite his grandfather being acquitted of the charges for Jacobite affiliations, the Fraser family's historical association with support for Scotland's Stuart line had in fact left a multi-generational impact. The sense of familial obligation in the Kuzzilbash and culturally inherited duty in the Highland Smugglers ultimately convey that Fraser's admiration for Iran's Turkmen tribes and Scotland's Highland clans reciprocally informed one another, and this reciprocity is based on his identification of the shared values between the two cultures, an understanding of an analogous history of oppression, opposition, and survival. So, to conclude, Fraser's exploration of the ideas about home, nation, and identity and belonging in the Kuzzilbash from the beginning to end are fraught with difficulty. Despite the favor that Ismail experiences with Nader and his army, the connection that he develops with the Turkmen culture keeps him at a distance from the Kuzzilbash soldiers. Still, because he's not Turkmen, he's also unable to live in complete unison with Salim Shireen and their tribe. These dynamics leave Ismail not fully belonging anywhere, and this lack of resolve is in fact his resolution. The end of the novel also leaves him with a sense of loss. Though he is with Shireen, his melancholic state about Salim's departure to return to his home sets the tone of the novel's conclusion. In his final words of narration, Ismail states, "He rushed from us, and in a moment was lost to our view." As Salim disappears from Ismail's sight, the swiftness with which he vanishes closes the narrative with a defining quality of evanescence. The joy that Ismail originally felt at being reunited with his friend is temporary. It is as impermanent as the Turkmen habitation at the Cheshme Jamali and subject to change, like Ismail's understanding of his identity and his perceptions about Iran's diverse societies. Iran's unstable social and political conditions during the rise of Nader Shah, and the uncertainty of Ismail's life, and his conflicting understanding of his cultural identity are the defining traits, though, in his experiences. They pose difficulties. However, these factors also positively lead to his relationships being more inclusive of Iran's many cultures. They cause him to appreciate reciprocal exchanges like those between Salim Nader and himself as a reflection of the shared values between societies whose resilience outweighs the pejorative implications prescribed to them. That is all I have for today, and thank you very much to everybody for being here.
Brenden, thank you very, very much. That was very interesting to look at that. I will take questions via the Q&A in Zoom and relay them to our speaker. I have a question myself
Yes.
about the extent of Fraser's ability himself to work in the languages of the different groups with which he came in contact, let alone those on which he focused.
Right. As in, how extensive was his knowledge of the languages of these people?
Yeah, I mean, for a start, how good was his Persian?
Fraser himself, among his contemporaries, I would say that he didn't have the strongest linguistic abilities.
Right.
He was more of a visual person. He loved to draw, he loved to paint. Linguistically, he was not the most strong. He was very lucky that he was part of these cohorts of the East India Company, where a lot of his people with him, they were very accomplished Persian scholars and were able to do a lot of the translation work for him in these interactions.
But they were mostly Persian speakers.
Mostly Persian speakers, yes, not
So what about the
necessarily,
other kinds of?
not necessarily Turkmen or
Right.
Kurdish or anything like that. He would sort of pick up bits here and there, and there are little traces of his understanding of certain words or phrases in his travel logs, but his actual comprehension of the languages were quite limited.
Right. Okay. Right. right, fine, thank you. I have a couple of questions now beginning to come in. One person here is asking, what was your motivation, if you don't mind, both personal and academic, for getting, I mean, how'd you get into this? Is the usual PhD viva sort of question.
Sure. Well, I suppose I myself being Iranian and being of mixed background, Iranian, Assyrian, Chaldean, I've always taken an interest into the societies that Iranian culture tends to perceive as peripheral ones. I also ended up meeting some Turkmen people for the very first time, which they are few and far between in the UK, which was a very interesting experience. And that sort of influenced a lot of my interest in my research on this topic specifically.
But the Scottish angle is quite, you're not also little bit Scottish then.
There is a Scottish angle. The Scottish angle, because I did my research in Scotland,
Okay.
and had a lot of access to some of the primary materials in Relic House itself. I was able to go and consult some of the collections there while I was doing a lot of my preliminary reading to figuring out what direction I wanted to take the piece in.
Right. That feeds into the second question that I have. Thank you very much. This is very fascinating. Could I ask if there's an accessible translation of the text that you could recommend for a novice to read?
A translation of the Kuzzilbash.
Yeah,
I mean, it is in English,
yeah,
and it is accessible through a lot of digital archives. Internet Archive Online has different versions of it. I will warn, it's quite a long text. This does take the form of the traditional three-volume 19th century novel, which is big and baggy and does ramble on and on. But if you want to find a copy, there are editions that can be read in-house at the British Library, and otherwise Internet Archive.
Are there differences in, so there's several editions. Are there detectable differences between these editions?
Not necessarily. Maybe just matter of page number and print and this and that.
So one could say, well, could one say that it was popular? I mean,
You know, it's a bit hard to say.
yeah,
Curtin believes that Fraser's writing was extremely popular. Um, Although I would say perhaps not as popular as a work like Maurier's Haji Baba of Esfahan. I think that really was sort of the pinnacle of pop culture related to Iran at the period. But it was relatively popular then. That in and of itself was actually another interest for pursuing the study of this text because it seems in many ways to have fallen to a state of neglect, along with a number of other texts by writers from this period.
that goes into another question that I just had. No, it was a comment here, not a question, but a comment. Thank you so very much for your fascinating talk and research. Then another question I have is terrific talk. And then again, segueing into your last comment, how does this novel compare with other British written works set in the same region at the time? So that would be, as you suggested, yeah. And can you comment on whether these were informed by each other?
In many ways, I would say that they were. These writers and travelers were all reading each other's work, if not directly working with one another in the first place. Um, Maurier was working with Sir Gore Ouseley and Sir Harford Jones. Fraser was probably reading these texts as they came out, given his association with people who worked within the company, his interest in the region. Um, the way that it compares, I would say that this is probably one of the more fanciful prose works. We see a lot of fantasticism in poetry, which you can actually read in the piece we did not discuss today, which is Moore's Lalla Rookh. But subjectively and thematically, there is actually, interestingly enough, quite a lot of interest in the peripheral societies and the societies that Iranian culture tends to want to shove off to the sidelines. Um, in terms of form, they're extremely different. It's very hard to actually chart consistency of form. But the thematic interests are very similar. There's an interest in returning to the past, whatever that past is, whether it's a century prior or 500 years prior or 1,000 years prior. Um, and in many ways, you can actually trace quite a lot of pseudo-Gothic elements in these revisiting of the past as well throughout these works.
That's interesting. I have another question here, and again, we're taking questions via the Q&A function in Zoom. Was Fraser's insistence on traveling to Bukhara against all opposition from the authorities in Mashhad, perhaps related to his interest in tribal culture?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is another thing that actually does tie into Moore's work. Moore's poem is set on the outskirts of Bukhara, just before the Abbasid Caliphate takes it as a stronghold, and it sort of tells the sort of a fantastical, fictionalized version of the fall of the city. Um, so yes, this region, Bukhara and all around it, has been home to the societies that Fraser himself was so deeply interested in, whether that is Uzbek, Turkmen, et cetera, et cetera.
And again, just to parse that for my own interest, I presume he didn't have any, as it were, Uzbek. So these are indirect connections that he's making with when he's traveling in these
Yes,
areas. Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Indirect connections that he's making, and that you sort of that it's very interesting when you read his work, and each individual text in some ways feels incomplete because he does ramble on and he's extremely descriptive, but he's not necessarily concise in his writing. However, when you are able to get through that and when you're able to read comparatively and transversely across his work, you start to see how that is actually the full picture. He's kind of figuring it out as he's going along and he's building the connections bit by bit.
What was the reception of this? Again, still taking a few questions. We have a few more minutes left. What was the reception or the feeling among his EIC companions? And what was the impact, if anything, on the company's understanding of the region and its dynamics?
That's a very good question, and one that I will admit I'm actually not too sure of.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because I gather they were also, going through the region. And of course,
Yes,
when one comes to later works, and the one that comes to mind is Curzon's
yes,
Persian question, who's very quite concrete, about what he sees
yes.
around him.
I mean,
Um,
what I will say that I think makes Fraser and his contemporaries really stand out, um, it has speaks a lot to actually what I believe was going to be a methodology that I was going to employ when I began my research and where I ended up, and those being two entirely different things. I went into this thinking that I would read Fraser, Moray, Malcolm, and be doing a lot of corrective reading, assuming that there was a lot of inaccuracy, and to some degree there is. But in fact, their novel perspective, and this being entirely fresh to them, in spite of the prejudice that is absolutely there, allows them to see a lot more clearly and be a lot more deep and insightful in their observation than people who later went to Iran. So they actually did a great deal better work of understanding these people and the cultural dynamics and these societies than those who had their work to benefit from in the first place.
yeah, I'm just thinking of the so-called Great Game and such that figures
Right.
much more prominently in the later part of the period. Here's a comment. I love that you use a style of storytelling and sharing your scholarly work. This is wonderful. I also enjoyed very much your focus on multi-identities and micro-narratives and micro-histories in your work. Thank you again and very best wishes on
Thank
your
you.
future endeavors. Yeah. So that, yeah, there you go. Well done, you. Yeah, I enjoyed it too. But again, I was concerned with his traveling. Did this have any impact on him in terms of his own family dynamics? Eventually, he's got his successful brothers.
Yeah,
How did this work in terms of his own family?
not necessarily. I wouldn't say it had any sort of negative impact. If anything, it probably bolstered him a little bit further because he was sort of seen as the sort of failing member of the family who couldn't make any business work. But his travels developed a successful literary career, and that made him sort of that rose him up sort of in the ranks of the family. And I mean, he died in the family estate. He spent his later years there, and he lived very comfortably, sort of painting and drawing from memory a lot of what he saw while he was in Iran.
Yeah, what's the provenance of the illustrations then? Those are
Sorry.
his later. You had the
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, there was something that he did a lot later in life.
Uh-huh.
I believe a lot of them are kept sort of in very dark archival rooms at the family estate at Relic House. There are sort of in new editions of his travelogues, there are some prints of his sketches in there that are sometimes included, but most of the paintings came a lot later in his life.
So again, there were several editions, and so maybe the earlier editions didn't have the as broad a range, if any, of those kinds of illustrations.
Right. Some.
Yeah. So if it went through several editions, then it certainly had some sort of a readership.
I don't know for sure. I would
Yeah.
say that the readership started to kind of drop off around the turn of the century, once we started making way into the 20th century. At that point, he kind of started to fall to the sidelines.
Did this have any impact on his grandfather's, on the popularity of his grandfather's work?
I'm I can't speak too much on the popularity of his grandfather's work. There's not much work on him, even by contemporary standards. There are a handful of biographers who've managed to do a lot of digging to gather some material, but because the grandfather was not necessarily a major figure within the East India Company, he was sort of a minor person. His text was not widely read, and it's sort of through the interest in the younger Fraser that a re-interest in the senior one and his works to sort of come about.
And how, final question, unless anybody is coming in, I'm kind of, but I have a lot of questions about the, because of Kuzzilbash, and I'm interested in Safavids. But to what extent can we say that his portrayal of Nader Shah, for example, was was evident in works that were going on talking about the Nader Shah period in his own later period? Because he presented a counter sort of a picture, and so
Yes.
uh, did it have any influence? Do we know if that had any influence?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it had much influence. I think it sort of stood out, and the readers understood that this stands out very distinctly from other historians, particularly given that a lot of the source material on Nader was mostly Mughal source material. And given his destruction of India and his sacking of Delhi, that source material is not favorable. And so that is sort of the much wider
Yeah.
corpus of material. So Fraser's much nicer version really sort of is the outlier, and people understood that even then.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank you very, very much. This is absolutely fascinating. And
Thank
again,
you.
echoing the comments of this one individual here, whom I will not name as is convention, it operated on all these different kinds of levels. And I found that absolutely fascinating, as clearly did the audience here as well. So very well done. I want to
Thank
thank
you.
everybody and wish everybody, as is customary, a good morning, if that's where you are, or a good afternoon, if that's where you are, or a good evening. And we'll see you then in June for our next discussion by Jamie Comstock. Skip, please watch the announcements that go out. Get on the BIP's various mailing lists via our social media platforms, all of which are there behind me. Brenden, once again, thank you very much, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you, Andrew. Bye.